Now, Alex Jones with Paul Joseph Watson wrote Why the Elite Would Lose a Civil War. It is a part 2. In the part 1, they explain why the elite are seeking a civil war. Basically, it's a tactic of division. It's a tactic of weakening confidence in the American system, scaring away investors, and, of course, setting up the New World Order system, the bankers themselves, as the saviors to basically seize upon civil unrest, broken down economy and everything else, because they're the ones who institute order out of chaos, of course, and outlining how really the system is showing us in so many ways through their amassing of bullets, through the continuity of government plan, through their Homeland Security occupation plan, how they want a war with Americans and how they're preparing for it and really trying to incite it over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. We don't really know if that is the timeline, but of course they factor in comments like those of Al Sharpton recently, who said, Americans, don't try to give me that nonsense about the Second Amendment. Your guns wouldn't do anything to stop drones. You're occupied by the American government already, so just give in and also shut up about that Second Amendment because you're ruled by drones. Well, history does not show that to be the case, and in spite of increasing technological diversionary tactics, of increased domination through the system, using drones, using tactical nukes, using perhaps a biochemical weapon, whatever, we see throughout history, in spite of all that, and in spite of huge standing armies, that resistance itself is its own force. It's difficult to deal with. And even in the case of Iraq, where you had 17,000 troops trying to block the roads, they couldn't quite do it. In Afghanistan, no empire has ever been able to defeat those mountain people, not necessarily the Taliban, those who are actually engaged in some form of terrorism, but the whole of the people who said they don't want to be occupied by any empire and that they know the land and that as long as they resist, basically we've been unable to defeat them, even though their numbers are maybe 25,000 at the most, and we have hundreds of thousands of troops in those countries, and in the general area we have superior weapons. Doesn't really matter as long as there's a true spirit of resistance there. So the question is, if something like that comes to our country, do we still have the spirit of resistance? Because resistance is victory. If they ever did start a civil war, even if you wrote off 90% of the population to being complacent with that system, to going along with it, if 5% of the population, if 10% resisted, that not only literally outnumbers any army forces controlled by the government now, but it's also a people who cannot be conquered through spirit, because you can always find a way to resist. Even if you are disarmed, there's ways to destabilize the enemy. And once you have victories, if they're moral victories, those amplify, those resonate with the people, and the sympathy starts to turn back towards the rightful people, if right is on your side. But where did that even come from? I want to read you this from 1765, because the colonial Americans who later fought a war against the British did have the spirit of independence in many ways. They did have the spirit to resist and to simply say no. And some people actually saw it coming, even on the British side. These are going to be the remarks of Colonel Isaac Barre. Now, he served in the French and Indian War, in the years preceding the American Revolution and the build-up to it. He served alongside those American patriots. He knew them well. He was friends with many in the merchant class, and he defended them in front of Parliament as a member of Parliament, basically a minority, not of one, but of just a couple, almost the only individual speaking out against the Stamp Act passed against the colonies in 1765. And this is really a "you didn't build that" speech. Today we have Obama saying the government's your daddy. We have Chris Rock saying Obama is the country's daddy. He's not only president, but he's also your daddy. He made it happen. We've got Obama giving the speeches saying you didn't build that, small businesses. The government helped you. Somebody helped you with that. Basically saying the government is the provider, and whatever they don't give you, you don't have. That same kind of attitude came from the British in those founding days of America. And again, Colonel Isaac Barre spoke against it. Consider the "you didn't build that" approach as he tells you what real Americans were made of. And they weren't always nonviolent. They weren't always sympathetic. They didn't always do the right thing. In fact, many of them didn't agree with each other. And yet they had the spirit of resistance. They sought to moral victories where they could find them, and there eventually was a momentum that built in their favor, leading to the ultimate victories. Now, here again, 1765, opposition to the Stamp Act being imposed on colonial America. They, planted by your care, No, your oppressions planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country. And yet, actuated by principles of true English liberty, they met all these hardships with pleasure, Colonel Isaac Berry said, compared with those they suffered with their own country. They nourished up by your indulgence, he asked rhetorically. No, they grew by your neglect of them. And as soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them in one department or another, who were perhaps the deputies of some members of this House, sent to spy on their liberty, to misrepresent their actions, to prey upon them, men whose behavior on many occasions caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them. Then Barry goes on, they, protected by your arms, they have nobly taken up arms in your defense. He's again referring to the French and Indian War, and goes on to explain all the bought and paid for in blood victories of those colonial Americans, and goes on to say, believe me, remember this day I told you so, 1765, that the same spirit of freedom which actuated that people at first will accompany them still. The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects to the king, but a people who are jealous of their liberties and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated. But the subject is too delicate, and I will say no more. He predicted so much of what would happen in the American Revolution at the time of the Stamp Act, opposing the Stamp Act, telling the king, telling the parliament, no, these are sons of liberty. These people have the spirit of freedom in them, and your oppression is only going to backfire. It's going to cause resentment in them, and it's going to give them moral victories. What did colonial America do? They said no to the Stamp Act. They intimidated the tax collectors who were meant to impose that act. They burned them in effigy. They sent mobs basically to say, if you collect those taxes, it's your last day in this colony. That first started in Massachusetts. It spread very quickly to Virginia, then to at least 9 of the other colonies, and the Stamp Act was repealed in Britain. They didn't know why, but they eventually caved in because they could see it wasn't going to do them any good, and people like Colonel Barry were right. That spirit of resistance was going to weaken the British position in colonial America. They interviewed Ben Franklin, who was already representing the colony of Pennsylvania, but who had also begun to represent several other colonies because he was such a widespread diplomat. Franklin, by the way, supported imposing the Stamp Act at first till he saw how much the Americans were against it. And they interviewed him, the British government did, overseas after the failure of the Stamp Act, and they asked, were the Americans loyal to the king and to the British system prior to the Stamp Act? Yes, they were, he said, but now they're not. They've turned against the king, and now they're agitated, they're upset. And they went on to ask Benjamin Franklin, if we just lessen the duties of the tax, if we just back off a little, will they comply? Will they submit? No, Benjamin Franklin said, those American colonists will never submit. And that's really the spirit of freedom. As long as some people retain that spirit of freedom, they'll never be beaten by any oppression, maybe temporarily, but in the long run, never beaten by any oppression, no matter how strong the force, as long as people keep that spirit of alive. And of course, we don't want to see a civil war. We want to say no to all that. We don't want violence. We want to tell the system ahead of time that it's going to be a failure for them. Because of the spirit of victory. We'll turn now to the daily quote. It comes from George H.W. Bush during also former President Gerald Ford's funeral, who was an admitted FBI plant inside the Warren Commission. But George H.W. Bush told the people during that funeral, during the eulogy, the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but the Warren Commission report will always have the final, definitive say on this tragic matter. Why? Because Jerry Ford put his name on it, and Jerry Ford's word was always good. Ladies and gentlemen, never doubt the word of Gerald Ford. We'll be back again tomorrow. Have a good evening. Have a good V-Day. Thanks for watching. Spread the word. Subscribe at prisonplanet.tv. Spread the word through planetinfowars.com, and never stop fighting that info war. It's not too late to turn things back around to the spirit of America.
Infowars.com is proud to introduce the new Infowars skateboards by Alien Workshop. Skaters have always been against the grain socially. Now wake up your friends politically. Just go to InfoWarsStore.com. We have Divide and Conquer or Brainwashing. Then take your deck to your local skate shop, pick out your own trucks, your own wheels, and then hit the streets and wake some people up. Here is legendary skateboarder Jake Nunn.
This one has a lot more concave than I have on my board, and I like concave. It makes it easier to turn and feel the board. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's almost the same shape as mine. It's not really a sport, and it's not really art. And it's just kind of freedom, you know. I've listened to Alex Jones for a long time, and I love what InfoWars does. I've always loved Alien Workshop too. Like, I think it's kind of cool you guys got together. This one's pretty nice. Definitely one for the wall, one for the collection. Also good to skate.
Get these limited edition decks at InfoWarsStore.com.
This is Jake Nunn. Get these beautiful new skateboards at InfoWars.com. Alien Workshop collaboration. Good stuff.